building a theme here, as you know, you have attended all the sessions, addressing the movement to different modes of communication and different ways of thinking, this invention of rationalism that I've been stressing. But it's taken a turn, which we began to address last week in discussing Thucydides, in which the world is not presented to this new modern thinking generation in the late 5th century BC as one that is set in stone the way an oral tribal system would present it, one rooted in mythological explanations of the universe. Suddenly, you have questions about what is at the foundation of human nature and questions about what is at the foundation of the gods, and isn't truth potentially relativist? And I ended the last session talking about how Euripides, the playwright, and Thucydides, the historian, as well as a new generation of thinkers called Sophists, began to present dark elements in human experience as possibly foundational elements built into the human constitution. And we're going to begin this week with a session that I call Plato and the Sophists, Philosophy, Justice, and the Soul, looking at Plato, the first of the really great systematic Greek philosophers and one of the great thinkers in all of Western civilization, how he took that as his text. These were the questions, the ones raised by people like Euripides and Thucydides. These were the questions that he wanted to respond to, and in an attempt to capture some of what he and others thought as the lost security, the lost certainty, the lost objectivity of that earlier way of organizing the world in thought. So you have him born, here's Plato born in 427, which is towards the beginning of the war. It's 2 years after the plague ran through the Athenian population. And he's going to last. He's going to live for 80 years, well into the next century. He had several famous influences and teachers, direct teachers, notably, and we'll talk about it in a second, the famous Socrates, about whom we have absolutely no concrete evidence other than the accounts in Plato and the accounts of a historian named Xenophon, two students of his who left us much detail and much hagiographical or admiring commentary on this heroic figure as they depict him, but one that we do not know directly. And so there's always going to be this open question, since Socrates becomes the major character in all Platonic dialogues. Is it actually Socrates, or is this a straw man character who is there mouthing the nostrums of Plato himself? So Plato's born early in the war, and he takes up the issues raised by Thucydides and Euripides and the war itself. The English mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead famously described the entire history of philosophy in the West as, quote, a series of footnotes to Plato, that everything that comes down the path between 350 BC and today is either a question raised by Plato or an attempt to answer a problem raised by Plato, or is a solution offered by Plato himself. The central questions that he raised in theory of knowledge, epistemology, if you will, metaphysics, ethics, politics are still with us. Christian theology, which has a kind of high point or acme in the first few centuries after Christ, but all the way through the Middle Ages into the modern world, was almost exclusively Platonist and inspired by Plato for 1,000 years. One could argue that the major Christian historians, even before St. Augustine, but certainly represented most perfectly by St. Augustine, who was born in 367 AD, that entire theological tradition, the so-called patristic tradition, the patristic literature is the writings of the so-called fathers of the church, that they were imbued with Platonist assumptions. And we'll get a chance to talk about that in a bit. We have a Roman depiction of his visage taken from Greek sources on the right. And on the lower right, the famous picture, which we may have looked at in other settings in this course, and in other classes by Raphael in the Vatican, this fresco of the School of Athens. It's got all the famous philosophers, but at the center, there is Plato on the left with his finger pointed above. And there's Aristotle on the right with his finger pointed outwards into the world of real objects. And we'll talk about why even the painters of the Renaissance depict them this way as we go on. The character Socrates, the historical figure, allegedly was born around 470 and then he fights in the war, actually, as an older man, but he still fights in the war. He is the teacher of the general Alcibiades, who Thucydides takes to task, as we looked at last week. And he's forced to drink the hemlock in 399 for making himself a total pest to the politicians and money people of the city of Athens, because he ran around puncturing their self-importance. And we'll see why Plato delighted in what his mentor Socrates was up to. So the influence and inspiration of Socrates and his dialectical method in particular, which is very enigmatic, the teacher who never teaches, the teacher who does nothing but ask questions, was so profound that Plato almost exclusively in dialogue form has Socrates as the central interlocutor. He's the spokesperson for Plato's own ideas. He discusses all sorts of issues. In Republic, he's going to talk about the issue of justice. And what we're led to believe is that the opinions of Plato himself are mouthed by the character Socrates. He credits Socrates with ideas that were very likely his own. Most modern students of philosophy or historians of philosophy will argue that past a certain set of seminal ideas that you get in Plato's early dialogues, up to and perhaps including some of the opinions in Republic, could be attributed to Socrates, or in some form or another could be argued that they were first held by Socrates. But in later dialogues that subsequent to Republic, Plato ventures off into realms that were most likely not ever thought of or articulated by the historical Socrates. Now, certain general influences on the both of them. Socrates was born early enough to have met Parmenides, that very important pre-Socratic figure, Parmenides. of Elea, and some of the later Pythagoreans, the even hazier, lost in time back in the 6th century followers of Pythagoras. Some of the later ones were probably known to Socrates and personally, and were probably significant influences on him. So Plato's interest in mathematical formalism, and I'm going to explain this a lot in subsequent slides, so don't get daunted by the use of a technical term, but his interest in mathematics and form probably derived from those predecessors, the Pythagoreans and the Parmenideans, and very probably were directly delivered to Plato via the teaching of Socrates. Plato's interest in the piety and moralism of the Pythagoreans most certainly came from Socrates, who was self-described, this gadfly, in one of the early dialogues in the Apology, where he defends himself against the argument that he should be sentenced to death at his trial, he argues that he tells a story, actually, Socrates, at his trial. And the story is that he goes around trying to ask people who claim to have real knowledge of how things work and how the world works and what are central values and the like, and they have reputations for this. And he lures them into those dialectical conversations by which he leads them through argument to positions in which they're contradicting themselves often and losing face, because these conversations often happen before other, young men of the aristocratic class. And Socrates becomes known as this gadfly, this fly that bites the rear ends of horses and provokes them into a response, and that they're constantly trying to swat away with their tails. And in the story that he tells of his own life, Socrates says, I realized I was being this pain in the neck and this pest by badgering any Athenian who claimed to know what he was doing politically and ethically and morally, that he went to the oracle at Delphi to ask the priestess of Apollo, the oracle, tell me about myself. And they said, well, Socrates, you are the wisest of all men. And he left with this kind of unexpected description of himself that he thought it was paradoxical. It had no basis in fact. He said, I don't know anything. He said, but when I ran around trying to pester people who claimed to have specialized knowledge about things, what I realized was, well, I do have an advantage over them in that I know that I don't know anything. And they're letting on that they are people who should be paid money to teach young people about the art of rhetoric, about the arts of politics and the like. And he said, well, I guess what the oracle was trying to tell me is that my wisdom is in that I don't know anything. So there's also an influence, Heraclitus, who introduced all sorts of skepticism about sense data, as did Parmenides, was a strong influence. And then the final great influence on Platonic development is the war itself. Plato's youth overlaps with the war, and the cynicism and moral relativism of that period were what he regarded as the crucial challenge to philosophy. That chapter on the plague in Athens that I had asked you to look at for last week, that terrifyingly accurate depiction of an unfolding and evolving cynicism and moral oblivion that develops as people face this massive, depressing event of the death of everyone, including their loved ones, and the suggestion that their own mortality is held just by a film, a thread of strength that really is not bolstered by an appeal to moral behavior or by an appeal to the gods. Religion doesn't seem to help. And there's a kind of despair in this dark view that emerges out of the war, and it's cynical, and it doesn't have faith in the utility of anything. It's nothing seems to help. And here is a young philosopher taught by a true believer, Socrates, in the old values, even though he himself is a practicing philosopher and asking questions about knowledge. Here he is inspired by this true believer who takes it as his role in life as a thinker to see if he can unfold and develop an alternative based in the new sciences and the new ways of thinking about the world that does produce a solid ground for ethical, hopefully ethical and moral political behavior. So by the time we get to Republic, written in Plato's so-called middle period, anywhere from 390 to 380. Remember, he's going to live to 347. Plato himself, by the way, becomes the teacher of Aristotle, which we will talk about more next week. Republic, because of the scope of issues that it raises, because of its size, it's a large book, especially for the ancient world, is certainly the best known book, and in some ways has to be regarded as one of the most important books ever written. Its influence is spectacular. We only have it through copies of copies of copies. And on the right, I show you a page from the oldest existing physical manuscript of Republic in Greek is actually a recent one. It's Byzantine from about 895 AD. So really only about 12 centuries ago, which makes it about 12 centuries after it got written. So it's, the oldest manuscript we have is halfway between the original and now. But we know that sections of it were faithfully reproduced and passed on medium to medium, but we know that medium get destroyed and libraries burned down. And it isn't until they started writing on calfskin and the like in the Middle Ages that things seem to last. And that calfskin stuff might wind up lasting longer than CD-ROMs and the like. But time will tell. The Greek name of the book is politeia, which is a word that means regime, or we don't have a good word in English. It's as if it's the word for government, but regime means the implementation of the ideas of good governance realized in the flesh. It's the regime. We call it Republic because Cicero, inspired by Plato, doing his own version on the topic, called his, in Latin, de republica, concerning the public thing. The res thing, publica, the public thing, which is, for the Roman, the regime, the government, the politeia. So the Republic was written as an extended series of dialogues, and it establishes his fundamental theory of knowledge, which he will revisit in later dialogues because some elements of it get challenged and he wants to refine the way it's thought about. But the basic structure of so-called Platonism and the Platonic theory of knowledge is built into the book, and we'll, in a couple of slides, hit it on head first. Its ostensible subject is justice, dikaiozune. It's a discussion of justice. And is justice a real thing, an objective thing? Is there actually a virtue called justice? Or is it a noun that we give to a kind of ever-shifting series of conventions that we make up to introduce some order into the chaos of human behavior, but that doesn't really have a core value or arete, what a Greek would have called virtue? Is there an actual virtue of justice by which a just person is happier and better off, existentially better off than an unjust person? Or is it that we just make up a set of rules and talk ourselves into the idea that you should be just, but we do need laws to punish the unjust, because justice itself isn't really an attractive, positive alternative? Without the threat of punishment, people wouldn't be just. And in fact, it's going to become an argument, as we will see, of whether or not people observe rules and laws and control their what we think of as their more bestial impulses, because that is better existentially for them? Or is it simply that we can't afford the chaos that grows out of sort of that Thomas Hobbes view of the state of nature as the war of all against all, that since we can't stand the chaos and threat to ourselves individually, that produces that we introduce this jury-rigged idea of justice bolstered by punishment and law simply as the lesser of two evils, that justice is a negative virtue. There's no real positive in it. It's just that we have to have a set of rules or else everybody will just be messed over. And that question becomes the central topic of justice, of the Republic. Is justice a real thing? It starts with the question of who's happier, the just man or the unjust man. And then as a convention, the discussion in the book morphs into an investigation of the nature and possibility of a just city. Plato has the character Socrates begin by saying, well, these are very deep waters, asking what justice is in the human soul or to the human soul. So can't we use allegorically a reference point and talk about what a just city would look like and how you would build a just regime in a city? And maybe in talking about that, we will learn how to start talking about the really central question of what does it mean to the individual person existentially. So the investigation later returns to the initial question, but at a much deeper level that touches on the nature of knowledge and the human soul. So a few remarks on the structure of the book. It's organized as a spiral of discussions on the same subject. So basically, the same question gets asked and answered multiple times all the way through the book. Each new attempt is more serious and deeper than the last attempt. And it's because each new attempt involves a different discussant or interlocutor. Socrates engages a series of people in discussion from sort of flimsy, cavalier, not well anchored people who are, they're at a coffee shop and they're discussing it civilly with Socrates, but they're really not invested in the conversation and they really don't care about the answer, to people who are incredibly motivated and deeply engrossed in the topic. And Socrates can then, and it's really part of Plato's theory of education, Socrates can raise the ante with people and talk about more serious levels of the problem as the student is willing to engage at an ever more serious level. So Plato is very subtly introducing us to the idea that the ability to learn is limited by the interests and disposition of the learner. You can only go so far with somebody who, as soon as it gets a little too difficult for their apparatus at that point, opts out of the discussion. So you need to, in effect, for the highest levels of understanding, have a student who is willing to stay the full route, someone who's really invested. So this little hierarchy that I produced at the bottom of the slide, these are the people he has the same discussion with, who are ever more serious, increasingly serious and invested interlocutors in the discussion. They really increasingly want to follow the topic where it leads. The first character he opens the book with is a man named Cephalus, who's an old, rich, conventionally moral person, sort of the country club gent who wants an afternoon's diversion, but mouths all the standard old chestnut nostrums that the old self-satisfied bourgeois at the country club would bring up in conversation, and doesn't want to particularly be bothered by any internal contradictions or difficulties in the argument. And as soon as the thing begins to get a bit too serious, says, it's been fun, Socrates, I'm up and out now. I've had an enjoyable few minutes or hour and a half or whatever it's been. I finished my tuna salad. I'm headed off to the back nine at that point, and he's out. The second discussant, Polemarchus, is a minor aristocrat who dabbles in intellectual discussions, fancies himself a serious coffee house type who likes to dabble, and he gets taken through a few sets of arguments until he's led into a kind of internal contradiction, something that contradicts his beginning assumptions. And he says, well, I'm not really up for this, but why don't you continue with my associate and teacher, Thrasymachus, who is one of these professional sophists that we've referred to a couple of times. These teachers who go around for money among the young aristocratic class that wants to pick up a certain polish so that they can enter the political arena, having learned rhetorical presentation, styles of argument, and the like, so that they can cut a figure in the political realm. He's one, Thrasymachus in particular, who claims to be able to teach rhetoric and the skills for success. Okay? This is a little beyond cable self-help stuff shown at 3 a.m. This is a man who's got a career based on it, and who's essentially adopted the more cynical elements of the political thought systems that emerged out of the Peloponnesian War, as we will see. He's going to be someone, Thrasymachus is going to be someone who basically says, look, it's an arena of public discourse. So you make all the pretty speeches, and there's certain things you can say. He's the media consultant. There's certain things you can say, and there's certain things you can't say. But of course, you're trying to manipulate the audience and can use, it's not about truth. It's about the impact that you can have. It's about the people you can turn to your frame of thinking. This sounds pretty appropriate these days, doesn't it? And he's going to try to use this argument with Socrates. We'll see what happens with that. After Socrates finishes with Thrasymachus, because Socrates leads him into a place that Thrasymachus doesn't want to be. He moves him into a contradiction that Thrasymachus, self-contradiction that Thrasymachus can't accept. And then the next discussed becomes Adeimantus, who is a brother of Plato, one of the kid brothers. He has 2 kid brothers. And Adeimantus is a well-intentioned discussant, and willing to take the argument fairly far, but is ultimately limited in that the final step in the discussion is left to yet another kid brother of Plato's, Glaucon, who is this passionate learner in the mold of the daimonic Socrates. Socrates claimed that the reason he was compelled to run around Athens, annoying people ultimately, which is why he's put to death, that as he questions them, is that he had a demon, a daimon, a genie, if you will. Daimon, in the Greek world, in the older religious sensibility, there was this sense that someone was propelled by an interior motivating force, a voice that they had to answer to. And Socrates claimed that he had a daimon that said, you must get to the bottom of what's true. Go ask everybody. And because everybody was saying, this is not good for your political career, Socrates, this is going to get you into trouble. Ultimately, they're going to make you drink the hemlock. And Socrates says in one of the earlier dialogues, but I can't help it. This is what my daimon compels me to do. I must do this. This is my purpose in life. And Glaucon is somebody of that mold. He will not give up the argument. He will not force the question. He will not force Socrates into taking the argument the last step into the final realms. And so, in Platonic terms, he is the perfect student, because the perfect learner is the one whose self-generated passion keeps pushing them and pushing them and pushing them. Education is something that you do to yourself, not something that is done to you by someone else. So the question, is the just man happier? Now, these itinerant teachers of the New Thought, the so-called Sophists, Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. They were called Sophists, half serious, half tongue-in-cheek, the wise guys, if you will. Sometimes they didn't teach rhetoric. Sometimes they actually taught science and principles of logic, and depending what people were interested in, medicine. They offered their services for payment to young men of standing. There were no scuole, there were no schools yet, liceos, there weren't lyceums yet, academies yet, there soon would be. For the most part, teaching was done, under the loggia at the agora, next to the markets, where people would gather and they would say, I really want to hear so-and-so. Gorgias of Leontini's in town. He's going to be lecturing on how to use alliteration and making speeches and the effects of rhyming and things, and how to use metrics and presenting arguments, how to dress up your prose, if you will. The favorite subject was rhetoric, of course, and it had great value because in the small city states, this is how you became a prominent person, a political figure, someone worth listening to. Many of them, Protagoras, or in Greek, Protagoras, Gorgias of Leontini, Prodicus of Kos. There were dozens of these known to the ancient world, some of which we have remnants of things that they taught, were quite respectable intellectuals and teachers, despite Plato's sort of slurs about them and the way he depicts the worst of them. Their grounding in critical thinking and in the wildly divergent opinions of the pre-Socratic philosophers, who were all arguing among themselves about what the nature of the arche was, or the logos of the universe was, led many of them to adopt a relativist position on philosophical issues. So Protagoras became very famous for an observation. One of the famous, he was very good at dropping, sententious lines, very, very powerful single lines. Man is the measure of all things, says Protagoras, by which he probably meant very accurately that individual experience colors each person's judgment, that every person's depiction of the same thing is going to come out with a kind of individually colored spin on it, and may have not gone further than that. But Plato is going to interpret this relativism, as he sees it, as he's going to drive it right to its logical conclusion. That if you start suggesting that everyone's opinion is slightly different than everyone else's, the logical conclusion at the bottom, if you force the issue, is going to be that maybe there is no objective truth. That maybe all you get is the social construction of reality. That all you get are people spinning their narratives of the real, and there is no digging behind those phenomena, the surface appearance of things, to what Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, called the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Can you know the thing in itself? And so in Republic, the mouthpiece for an extreme relativism that wants to deny levels of objective truth is Thrasymachus. He becomes the mouthpiece for a cynical view of conventional morality and the defender of the position that, although it cannot be publicly admitted, the unjust man is happier than the just man. And everyone but a fool knows this. And again, I refer back to the plague chapter in Thucydides. So, to look more closely at Thrasymachus and that discussion, the ruler, Thrasymachus says, and because we're talking about the just man, and justice is a political virtue, the ruler is out for his own interests, not the interests of the ruled, but his own interests. He's trying to get ahead. He's shucking and jiving to come into office. He's lining his own pockets. You also believe that the rulers in the cities, this is Thrasymachus being quoted, those who truly rule, think about the rule differently from the way a man would regard sheep, and that night and day they consider anything else than how they will benefit themselves. And you are so far off about the just and justice and the unjust and injustice that you are unaware that justice and the just are really someone else's good, the advantage of the man who is stronger and rules, and a personal harm to the man who obeys. So you're back in the Melian dialogue in Thucydides with the Athenian voice saying to the Melians, come on, let's strip all the superficial, conventional language away that isn't supposed to be said in public, because wouldn't you be a bad guy if you got before the public and said, I'm Vladimir Putin and I want the entire planet to myself? That is not socially acceptable. You go and you make nice in front of the TV camera, but what do we really know underneath is I want as much as I can have, as much as I can force, as much as I can take. And that is what becomes justice in my world. Underneath the admirable person, what did Trump call Putin? A genius. The admirable person is the person who can line his own nest and to the greatest possible degree and in the greatest fashion imaginable. So ultimately, the tyrannos, the tyrant, becomes the model of the ultimate admirable person for this Sophist Thrasymachus. I am speaking of the man, this is up in the top paragraph. I just now spoke of the one who is able to get the better in a big way. Consider him if you want to judge how much more to his private advantage the unjust is than the just. You will learn most easily of all if you turn to the most perfect injustice, which makes the one who does injustice most happy. He's the guy who gets to take the most. And those who suffer it and who would not be willing to do injustice, most wretched, the followers, the sheep. And that tyranny, which by stealth and force takes away what belongs to others, both what is sacred and profane, private and public, not bit by bit, but all at once. All at once. So the tyrant exemplifies the idea that the unbridled satisfaction of appetite, which is a word I've bolded here because it's going to become important over the next few slides. The idea that the unbridled satisfaction of appetite is desirable. You get what you want. Fear of punishment in conventional society, only fear keeps men in line. Law, therefore, it's Thomas Hobbes. Law, therefore, is the construct of the weak. When someone does some part of this injustice and doesn't get away with it, he is punished and endures the greatest reproaches. Oh, temple robbers, bad guys, kidnappers, bad guys, burglars, housebreakers, defrauders, thieves, bad guys, are what they call those partially unjust men who do such evil deeds. But when someone, in addition to the money of the citizens, kidnaps and enslaves them too, instead of these shameful names, he gets called happy and blessed, not only by the citizens, but also by whomever else hears that he has done injustice entire. For it is not because they fear doing unjust deeds, but because they fear suffering them, that those who blame injustice do so. So the tyrant who takes everything by force, the Kim Jong-un of the world, is for him, this is somebody you don't call a crook. This is something you call the master. So Socrates, injustice, when it comes into being on a sufficient scale, is mightier, freer, and more masterful than justice. And as I have said from the beginning, the justice, the advantage of the stronger, might makes right, and the unjust is what is profitable and advantageous for oneself. So, Socrates then leads Thrasymachus through a series of arguments, starting from some first point that Thrasymachus suggests, and leads him into a contradiction that Thrasymachus doesn't like, and which winds up at least tying him up in a logical knot, and he gets angry and sort of, sulks out of the room and walks away from the discussion. But the star pupil Glaucon, he raises Thrasymachus' argument to a philosophical question. And he says, okay, I don't want to make the claim that the tyrant is the most desirable moral state of a human being, like Thrasymachus was doing, because he's teaching people how to succeed in politics, and it's his business, and he's going to make money by showing people how to take advantage of other people. That's his point. He's got a career investment. I don't want to go that far. Glaucon, let's dispense with that. That's going to be silly. But the fundamental underlying question becomes important. Do people act justly simply for fear of punishment? And there is no objective virtue, justice, or is justice an objective value and a good in itself? So he challenges Socrates. He says, look, I want to posit a perfectly unjust man who appears to be just, and a perfectly just man who appears to be unjust. There is no punishment for injustice and no reward for justice. Prove that the just man is better off. So he sets up this hypothetical. The greatest, slimiest, but on the surface, admirable, sociopathic person that you can imagine versus a true Job, a moral man who everyone, because of this on the surface, everyone reviles him and thinks he or she is scum. Now tell me, Socrates, how is it, and this is the style of their lives all the way to death, one person has fooled everybody. One person is nothing but one big appetite posing as, Joan of Arc. And the other person is, Francis of Assisi on the inside, who everyone thinks is Joseph Stalin on the outside. And they live their lives in those conditions, and then they die. You tell me how that second one is better off than the first one. How and why? That second one is better off than the first one. And he does it, we'll just dip at these quotes a little bit. The perfectly unjust man must be given the most perfect injustice, and nothing must be taken away. He must be allowed to do the greatest injustices while having provided himself with the greatest reputation for justice. And let the other guy be just the reverse of that. And then at the very bottom in yellow, at the bottom of the page, let him go unchanged till death, seeming throughout life to be unjust, although he is just, so that when each has come to the extreme, they can be judged as to which of the two is happier. So the question has been set. This happens around the end of book 3 or just early into book 4 of 12 books. And Socrates then proposes, he says, look, I want to answer your question, but we just can't leap to it. Because there's too much that we have to understand before we can get to what I think is the legitimate answer to that question. So can't we first ask what a just city would look like as an analogy of the just man, of the individual man? And that this will throw light on the deeper question. So then they begin a discussion of the guardians of a just city, those who are empowered to keep the city well ordered and running and just. They need to be educated. Good. Cities require guardians to maintain order for the benefit of a healthy city. The guardian should be wise, courageous, just, and temperate. They can't be wolves ravaging the sheep the way Thrasymachus would have had it. So they must be properly educated for their role. And then he proceeds to discuss what that education should look like. And this becomes one of the early great paradoxes of the book. This is the bit, and we talked about this when we were talking about oral poetry in the first and second sessions. This is that famous argument of Plato's when he says poetry, the poets have got to be banned from the city. This great paradox. We think of poetry and art as something that ennobles universally human nature. And here he's saying, no, you got to get rid of these guys. First out of the gate, you want to have a just city, you need to educate the people who maintain a city that's in the best interest of all the citizens. Get rid of the poets. Why? 2 reasons. One is that poetry uses imitation, mimesis, okay? Poets and rhapsodes indiscriminately imitate all character types, good and bad, right? You see films all the time where the most engaging protagonist is sometimes a heavily compromised moral figure. And the audience, the guardians in this case, are going to get drawn in. So if a man, says the character Socrates, is able to become every sort of thing and to imitate all things, if such a person should come to our city, we would fall on our knees before him as a man sacred, wonderful, and pleasing. God, you're wonderful, Euripides, or Sophocles, or whomever, but we would say that there is no such man among us in the city. We can't abide it. We ourselves would use a more austere and less pleasing poet and teller of tales for the sake of benefit. One who would imitate the style of the decent man and would say what he says in those models that we set down as laws at the beginning when we undertook to educate the soldiers. And the second trait of art, poetry, if you will, is musique, music. It is powerful. Poetry is inspirational. And it must be limited to depicting virtue. It uses rhythm and harmony, the rhapsodes, the rhapsody of music, of poetry, the sheer persuasive power of poetry. And his little quote, rhythm and harmony most of all insinuate into the inmost part of the soul. These people have demons of their own. They what they do, he would say the Homer or the Sophocles is sacred, wonderful, pleasing, magical, powerful, overwhelming. But they don't know what it is that they should be teaching the guardians of the ideal, perfect, just city. They imitate everything. They blow up on the big screen into images of lust and avarice and whatever they see in the world. The artist, the uncontrolled artist, if you will, lionizes all human experience and takes as their text whatever they find. Not just people that they're trying to mold, but everybody. Poets have technical knowledge and a sort of demonic talent. They are dangerous for Plato at this point in the ideal city. And so he then winds up, as he further dictates what the education should be. The poets have been excluded from the city. And the city has three classes. There are the rulers, the guardians. There are auxiliaries, sort of soldiers, implementers, if you will. And then the citizens, people who are artisans and farmers and what have you. They've all been properly instructed, but won't the usual class animosities and social issues arise all again? Each polis often degraded into class rivalries, and why do they get to rule and not us? Even if we've ideally put the most thoughtful people at the head of the city. And he asks the question, what has the moral and psychological force to maintain a cultural equilibrium in a healthy city? And ironically, another one of the great Platonic myths, he says myth. You have to create a noble lie. Even in a healthy and just city, individuals require a sustaining narrative. There's got to be some story we tell ourselves, hey, gang, this is why we do this. It's the Roman Republic. It's Sparta. It's this idea of we as a unit are better and larger than we as individuals, and we all have to take one for the team in the best possible way. Few are capable of the philosophical effort to reason their way to justice, so you're going to need a kind of a myth. So he says, I'll attempt to persuade first the rulers and the soldiers, then the rest of the city, that the rearing and education we gave them were like dreams. They only thought they were undergoing all that was happening to them. Well, in truth, at that time, they were under the earth within, being fashioned and reared themselves, and their arms and other tools being crafted. He's creating a birth myth, a cosmological myth, a cosmogonical myth. The myth, and he creates the myth of the three social classes: people of gold, silver, and then of iron and bronze. We shall say to them in telling the tale, but the God and fashioning those of you who are competent to rule mixed gold in at their birth. This is why they are most honored. And auxiliaries, silver, and iron and bronze, and the farmers and the other craftsmen. So because you're all related, although for the most part you'll produce offspring like yourselves, it sometimes happens that a silver child will be born from a golden parent, a golden child from a silver parent, and similarly all others from each other. So he tries to introduce this concept of social mobility into what has looked to several modern political theorists as a kind of totalitarian model. Plato has described a very socially controlled Spartan type of city. But what I'm going to suggest here is that his point really isn't about the city, that the enterprise is going to be about educating the individual person, and we'll see what we might mean by this. And while he's still talking about the city, he introduces the concept of the philosopher king. And he says, so unless the philosopher's rule is, his audience would have laughed this out of the park, the idea that the people you should put in charge are the intellectuals. The philosopher's rule is kings, and those now called kings and chiefs genuinely and adequately philosophize, and political power and philosophy coincide. In the same place, while the many natures now making their way to either apart from the other are by necessity excluded, there is no rest from ills for the cities, my dear Glaucon, nor I think for humankind, nor will the regime we have now described in speech, theoretically, ever come forth from nature. You will not happenstantially produce such a city. It's either got to get deliberately constructed from the beginning, or it is never going to exist. This is what for so long was causing my hesitation to speak, he says, seeing how very paradoxical it would be to say, for it is hard to see that no other city would there be private or public happiness. So the poet doesn't know the good. It's not the expertise of poetry. It's not why we value poetry or art. But appetite must be restrained, guarded against, and directed by a ruler that knows what is healthy. Mama's giving you castor oil in the ideal group unit, the family. It's for your own good. There must be somebody who is saying you shouldn't eat that entire package of Oreos instead of your vegetables. Appetite must be restrained and constrained, guarded against, and its direction must be dictated not by the poets who say, hey, if you cut those Oreos with a little bit of Coke, now that would taste great. It's got to be directed by people who actually have knowledge of what constitutes physical and mental well-being and health. So the poets must be banned from the city in which we are building a culture of justice until the forms of moderation, courage, liberality, magnificence are recognized, and until political power and philosophy coincide. And hearkening back to the arch poet of the Greek world, Homer, Achilles, in his rage, is about to kill Agamemnon and is restrained. That's a typo, that says restrained by the goddess Athena. And a quote, he broke off, and anguish gripped Achilles. The heart in his tugged chest was pounding, torn. Should he draw the long, sharp sword slung at his hip, thrust through the ranks and kill Agamemnon now? Plato, as the spokesperson for trying to drag people into this new realm of critical thinking and out of the oral mythopoetic model of thinking, okay, saw in Achilles as a hero, a detriment in this new age of literacy and rationality and philosophy. Achilles could not be a citizen. His honor is private. He's heroic for a superhero that he is, getting angry, about to pull out his sword and kill the king, restrained only by a goddess, not by an internal resource of his own, not by some model that he has in his thinking brain that says, this is no way to organize a political response. Despite everything in my gut would take great satisfaction from doing it this way, Achilles is not a citizen of a city. So he then establishes, goes on in the book after this, and extending the analogy, Socrates explains that the city and the individual soul are both comprised of three classes. So what he talked about as the three classes of the city in theory, he said, think of the soul as having three aspects. Think of the psyche, the mind, if you will. Think of the whole person, if we try to use more modern framing for the discussion, the whole person. Think of the person as constructed out of appetite. His word would have been eros, the erotic, the desiring element, which is in and of itself a shape changer. My appetite now wants this. Once I've had some of that, oh, I'm sated. Now I want that. It stumbles blindly from one pleasure to the next. And if it comes to control the soul or rule the city, it becomes a tyrant. The appetitive person at the head of the city is a tyrant. The appetitive soul is a drug addict when appetite rules every other impulse. Then the soul or the city is literally out of control. It is not controlled. Then there is the emotive dimension of the psyche, thumos, thymus, emotion, the spirited element, as he calls it, that when properly directed can supply the discipline required for temperance and health. When misdirected, havoc results. That's Achilles. Achilles is the thymotic figure. He is in control of his appetites, but his impulse to apply, if you will, the discipline required to restore his honor, that spirited emotional element is completely dominates his person. And then there is the reason, the logos, the logistikon, the calculating element of the soul, which is capable of knowing and judging the good, and which provides direction in the healthy person or city. One part we say was that with which a human being learns, and another that with which he becomes spirited. And as for the third, because of its many forms, we had no peculiar name to call it by, but we named it by what was biggest and strongest in it. For we called it the desiring part on account of the intensity of the desires concerned with eating, drinking, sex, and all their followers. And so we also called the money-loving part because such desires are most fulfilled by means of money. And because Sigmund Freud was a very close reader of Plato and the classical Greek intellectual literature, look at the correspondence between those three classifications of the soul and id, ego, and superego. The id, basically, Freud takes chapter 8 of Republic and just built an entire theory on it. So the id is this ego, this eros, this appetite. This ego is the reasoning self, which can rationalize its way into direction. And the superego is that element of conscience that we habituate to serve the purposes of right order in our activity. He then proceeds to depart as he's talking about the structure of the soul and the pursuit of knowledge by which we come to know what is the right direction for the soul. He elaborates an entire theory of knowledge that first is introduced through the allegory of the cave. And basically here, instead of reading everything on this slide, let me make this picture larger. And basically, and this, if you read this section, you'd be familiar with it, but it's very famous and you may have encountered it in college courses when you were younger. And basically, he uses this metaphor for likening the way humans learn things and see things and understand things. And he says, assume that we're like people who are in a cave and there is a hole with the sunlight coming through, first a fire within the cave before we even get to the sunlight, a fire which is casting shadows onto a wall. And what we get to see, what our perceptions are these shadows of things on a wall, flickering past. That the things themselves, the concrete things themselves, are these little statue-like objects that are being marched as if by puppeteers along the edge of the wall. And that for each one of these, the shadow gets distorted and imperfectly reflects the shape and structure of the thing itself. And he wants to suggest that our perceptions in the world are like these shadows. The things that generate the perceptions, these ideas that are not directly perceived, but indirectly perceived, and we'll talk about how he thinks this occurs, are like these objects on the wall, and the light is the activating principle by which we see it. And ultimately, this light is a spawn of the sunlight outside the cave. And if you really wanted to understand how things existed in and of themselves, you would have to unchain yourself from this wall and walk around it, see the objects, and follow the road out of the cave and be able to stare directly into the sunlight. As he says in the bottom here, then finally, I suppose, he would be able to make out the sun, not its appearances in water or some alien place, but the sun itself, the source of all knowledge, in its own region, and see what it is like. And after that, he would already be in a position to conclude about it that this is the source of the seasons and the years, and is the steward of all things in the visible place, and is in a certain way the cause of all those things he and his companions had been seeing. Sunlight as a kind of existential source of all things. You'll see why later Christian theologians fall in love with Plato, because they thought in a kind of pagan way he was anticipating God as this source of light out of which everything else grows and emanates. So later on in the same book within Republic, he breaks this down more directly as he introduces his theory of forms, of which the cave is a metaphor. And he creates the so-called line, the divided line, a visual model of the structure of knowledge and perception. So, on the left, you have things as they really exist, and on the right, under metaphysics, and on the right, epistemology as the mind, the function of the mind that comes to know the things on the left. Epistemology is the theory of knowing, metaphysics is the theory of being. And he wants to argue that there's a kind of bottom-up hierarchy to existence, and that in the visible world, okay, below the line here, there are sensible particulars, objects in the world. You know, you see a barn, you see a dog, you see water running, you see a number on a blackboard in the visible world. Sometimes there are just sort of shimmering images of those things, or made up images altogether that don't even exist, objects of the imagination. In fact, it's the imagination. So I can suggest to you, okay, think of a house with a red door. That house may not exist, but I can have you use your imagination to picture it as if it did exist. So that's a stage even lower than the actual house with a red door that perhaps exists. And if it exists, can be perceived. So the act of using your senses to perceive it. But above that, there is a realm of forms, the lower version of which are just numbers, mathematics and the like. But then there's this realm of higher forms. And he wanted to suggest that just like the shadows on the wall and the objects, the shadows cast on the wall and the objects on that wall in back that were being paraded along by the puppeteers, that the way language works, and he's relying very heavily on people like Parmenides here, that the idea of forms is that what we really know, when you understand the idea of a dog, and we speak and we use language, and I was going to say, I've got this little dog at home who is a cockapoo, et cetera, and we're having this conversation, that the idea dog is applied to the actual number, the actual real dogs in the world, because all those real dogs in the world, and there are millions of them, all those real dogs in the world participate in that idea. They are imperfect imitations of the idea dog. Just like all the triangles that I draw on a blackboard, or that we see in the world when we say, oh, that yard is triangular or whatever, are imperfect copies of the mathematical form triangle. And that these forms are sometimes called ideas. It's idoi, or paradigms in Greek. The forms, ideas, paradigms, they're eternal, unchanging patterns that really exist in their own realm. They really exist. And the particulars of the world that we see around us are flawed copies of that higher, real existence. And that the sun, which he, in the allegory, is what he calls the good, which is the form of forms. It is that which stands above even all those pure ideas, which he calls the forms. Therefore, say that what provides the truth to the things known and gives the power to the one who knows is the idea of the good. What does everybody want deep down? They want the good. Everybody acts for what they consider to be the good, but only the person who has fine-tuned his or her critical apparatus knows how to perceive what the good is objectively. And as the cause of the knowledge and truth, you can understand it to be a thing known. But as fair as these two are, knowledge and truth, if you believe that it is something different from them and still fairer than they, your belief will be right. So there is something that can be known certainly, that informs the world of uncertainty. He wants to say that those people talking about relativism and variability is because they're locked into trying to describe the perceptions in this world of opinion down here. But if they knew how to examine it properly, they would see that all of the wrong, miscalculated, aberrant opinions are reliant on a world which, in a properly structured, philosophically trained mind, world of knowable forms that are not changeable, that are eternal, that can be known certainly, that are real, and that are thrilling. In fact, he, in his discussion with Glaucon, he says that the true philosopher capable of contemplating the highest forms derives such pleasure, even Eros has a higher form to it, derives such pleasure that it will be a problem to get them to attend to ruling. The philosopher kings, to the degree that they're really philosophers, have to be forced out of the world of contemplation to rule us, to give us direction. It will be a mission. They're going to have to be forced into civic duty because they're not going to want to do it. Plato has introduced the idea that the person with the ability and determination to pursue philosophy is ultimately driven to the goal by something that is, in a sense, erotic. Now, I don't want to spend too much time in this, but implicit in this, and he explicates it in some of the other dialogues, is the idea that, in his theory of forms, is the idea that the forms can't be learned from sense data directly. In other words, things in the world, using the example of equality, things in the world that appear equal are only imperfectly equal. That is, they are not equality itself, which is the form. Reflecting on imperfectly equal things, the idea of equality is triggered, intuited, recollected, remembered. This famous theory of recollection of his from one of the earlier dialogues. Therefore, in other words, you can't know what the forms themselves by observing sense data. All you get are the shimmering shadows on the wall. Therefore, under the head. Therefore, when you make the leap, when the kid who you're teaching finally gets the idea, you hold up, you're trying to teach the kid the concept of two. You got this toddler. You hold up two apples and you say two. Now the kid knows they're apples, and the kid's probably a little confused at the beginning because you're saying two. And then you hold up two books and you say two. And then two glasses and you say two. And then two beach balls and you say two. And then at some point the kid has an aha moment and goes, oh, I get it. You're not talking about apples and books and glasses and beach balls. You're talking about the quantitative aggregate called two, two-ness. I get it. Well, he's saying that you were led to this. Plato is suggesting that you were led to this by the teacher through a discipline, the Socratic method of question and answer that led you to make the leap yourself. They didn't give you the idea of two-ness. They helped you trigger it into your aha moment. Therefore, if you recollected it, he's suggesting, if it was in there, if it was built in, if it was hardwired, I suppose today you would get like a Chomsky linguistic theorist saying that there are understandings of this order that are hardwired into the physical structure of the brain. He would say, if the idea was there and it was known before the sensory experience of two books, two glasses, two whatever, and since the idea of two-ness is an eternal idea, as is the idea of equality, and exists in its purity out there, it doesn't need a human brain. Equality exists without all the human brains that can think the idea of equality, he's suggesting. Since this knowledge does not come through sense perception, we must have acquired it before we acquired sense perception, and therefore before we were born. Therefore, our souls must have existed before we were born. QED, he wants to argue, the soul is immortal. And he says at one point in the Republic, haven't you perceived that our soul is immortal? He uses a slightly different proof. I use this one because it's a more accessible way into the issue. So he engages, when he engages in this question and answer dialectical method, when he engages the student, it is to wake up the curious and well-disposed student to the higher understanding that lies within, to trigger the recollection, is one of the reasons he uses this method. And he also uses it to force antagonistic adversaries, ill-disposed adversaries, into absurd or contradictory positions based on their wrong-headed first assumptions. And that was Thrasymachus. So again, this is where I just mentioned again that Oracle of Delphi story. He was the man who knew that he was wise because he knew what he didn't know. And then our last slide, comment. All of philosophy is nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato. It's had a staggering impact. The argument for a higher realm made it appealing to early Christian theologians looking for a rationalist foundation for the tenets of revelation. So really, for him, the more real place is the higher realm. The forms really exist. That's why it's sometimes called Platonic realism. Their ideas, sometimes it's called Platonic idealism, but it's often called realism because he thought those ideals were real. His approach made the classical curriculum palatable to a church that previously felt threatened by this intellectual bastion of the pagans, philosophy. Plato and the Neoplatonists were the vanguard for Christianity's ideological takeover of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. The epistemological argument for a formal realm resonates in modernity with echoes in German idealism in the 19th century, Kant and Hegel, structuralism in anthropology and linguistics, Chomsky in linguistics, and virtually every aspect of educational theory. And here, people famously love to take Platonic scenes and put them in art. Jacques-Louis David and the death of Socrates, and Plato and his students gathered around him as he's being handed the cup of hemlock, and a mosaic of the Academy of Plato, the school that gets established. And this is from Pompeii, one of the great Pompeian mosaics. And I see I've exhausted my time. I'm going to stop the share. And some people had to run to another class, I know. And I'm going to remove the pen. And there we have it. So if anybody...
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you again for making my head explode. Could you talk a little bit about what Christianity was like before the influences of Plato? Because, I mean, there was still like heaven and hell, and if you don't behave, you're going to hell.
I did a lecture on this for the adult school that got recorded.
Okay.
A Zoom class, which I will point you towards. It's on, it's not on the Mill site because it wasn't a Mill class.
Okay.
But I will send you and anybody else who's interested the link. It's not just on that topic, but it's on the topic of the growth of Christianity. And it spends a lot of time. Basically, I mean, this is the 10-second version of a 3,000-year argument, okay? Basically, the early Christianity was rooted in the story of the passion, death, and resurrection, the so-called charismatic story, as the early evangelists described it. And they some of them tried to make sense of it in terms of the Jewish tradition. Some of them tried to make sense of it only in terms of the salvation cults of mystery religion in the Mediterranean. But it never had a formal philosophical explanation until some early thinkers began to see the overlap between Platonism and Christian philosophy and how grace could have been used as an analogy of the sun in Plato, for instance, or the realm of forms. But before it just wasn't, it argued not from philosophy. Earlier Christianity argued from biblical sources and just another frame of mind altogether. But it's too short. This
Okay.
is not the time
Thank
of the.
you. I look forward to, looking at that tape. I'm
Okay.
going to be embarrassed if I see that I was at the class, but thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? We lost a lot of people already. Okay. If not, what I will do. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you.
Next week, we're on to Aristotle, and it is a different thing altogether. See what he does with it. But it's the hardest thing to do, even in this kind of sort of survey class, is to treat a book like Republic in an hour and a half. I used to do, I did it twice at NYU. I did a class which spent 15 weeks, and all we read was Republic. And so we did a kind of line by line unpacking of the work. And I told the students who enrolled for it, I said, I know what you're in here thinking, how we're going to spend 15 weeks on this book. And I guarantee you that at some point, you're going to accuse me of having raced through it recklessly and not doing justice to the detail of the text. Anyhow, and I was right. They agreed with me. I'll see you guys next week.